For joining Junction Reads. This is our second last event of the season. I can't believe it. I am thrilled to welcome Dorothy Ellen Palmer today. She is joining us from Toronto, from her place in Toronto, and we're going to talk about her novel Kerfuffle, which is very funny, very tragic, very political, and I can't wait to talk about her the novel and hear Dorothy read. Before we officially get started, I'm going to share an acknowledgement of land. Feel free, if you are not in Toronto, to acknowledge where you're joining us from, either in the chat or to yourself personally. Junction Reads exists in Toronto, which for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Wyandot, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I am specifically in Adubagok, the place of the alders in Michisagic language. Both are still home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and I am very grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on their territory. Dorothy Ellen Palmer, welcome to Junction Reads.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. I'm
excited to actually see you in person and not mediated through one of our shared social media apps. One of my favorite parts of Junction Reads is hearing what writers who join us are currently reading. And I'm hoping that you'll share with everybody what you're reading right now.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. Although I'm going to give you a slightly more unusual answer than you might expect.
Yay.
First of all, I want to do a short image description for accessibility purposes.
Thank you.
I'm an older woman with gray hair and glasses. I'm wearing a purple shirt. I'm sitting in my living room. Behind me is a large wall hanging that I made to represent all my weeks of isolation during the pandemic. On one side is my walker, on the other side is my mobility scooter, because the camera lies, it makes me look abled and I'm not. And I think it's important that I include all that.
Thank you.
As for what I'm reading, that is always a question that makes me so nervous, because I feel like I'm judged by it. I feel like I'm supposed to support the books of my friends. And I have decided lately that I'm going to answer that completely honestly from now on.
Thank you.
So for accessibility reasons, I'm really impacted about what I can and can't read. I can't read physical books anymore. I can't pick them up. I can't carry them. I can't hold them. So I have to read on my e-reader. I live on the poverty line like most disabled people. Mm-hmm. And my ancient Kindle is not supported with a browser. So I can't hook up to a library. So I can only read free books. So lately I have been reading every Scottish mystery set in Scotland in the history of the world.
Wow.
And have been enjoying that immensely. As long as they're free, I can read them.
That's incredible. And so what are some of them? Because I would love to. There's too many.
Too many. They're all in series, and they're all, you know, some of them have kind of Miss Marple characters as detectives, and some of them are police procedurals. And I love Scotland, so it's just enjoyable for me to see them wandering around Inverness. So it's fun.
That's fantastic. So if they go on to their Kobo or Kindle, they can just search Scottish crime mysteries and they'll come up. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. That's awesome. So we are going to have two readings today, split up by a question. I love when things are different, and thank you, Dorothy, for allowing us to do it differently today. But before we get started with your readings, do you mind if I share your biography with everybody? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dorothy Ellen Palmer is a mom of two, a binge knitter, a former English drama teacher, improv coach, and union activist. Now a disabled senior writer and disability activist. Her novel, When Fenelon Falls, from Coach House Books, and her adoption disability memoir, Falling for Myself, from Woolsack and Wynne, were acclaimed by the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and the Quill Enquirer. She is the winner of the 2020 Helen Henderson Award for Disability Journalism, serves on the Festival of Literary Diversity's Accessibility Advisory Committee, and has appeared at Fold, Gritlit, Word on the Street, The Next Chapter, The A-List, and CBC Radio. She can always be found tweeting at DE Palm. Dorothy.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to be reading the first portion of Kerfuffle from the very beginning. Kerfuffle is set during the 2010 G20 protests in Toronto. And the improv troupe named Kerfuffle doesn't just appear at night on stage, apparently also appears at night doing something a little bit different. Act 1, Friday, June 25th, 2010. Some buildings are as alive as we are. Some live like cats. They purr, they hiss. They get prized and petted, or neglected and abused. Gifted with a long view of history thanks to their more than 9 lives, buildings become wise by staying curious. As their keen eyes pierce darkness, they see all humans try to hide. In the dark before dawn on this steamy June weekend, our red brick, green-eyed Grimalkin, Black Cat Theater, is restless. She slips her back window, climbs ivy, scales the roof, and mounts the chimney. Hers is a panoramic view of iconic Toronto crosswords. Dotted along Queen Street, scurrying up and down Spadina Avenue, streetcars squeak by like massive steampunkian mice. But more than vermin are afoot tonight. Black Cat's prowling eyes are not the only beams of light. Flashlights, 5 of them. Quickly on, quicker off. Greenhorn night stalkers cloaked in black. Inexpert hunters attempting silence, but proving too eager to succeed. Hefting weighty backpacks, they sneak up her flank to scout her obviously empty alley. Black Cat squints her emerald eyes. When they should be sleeping, these silly kittens are out losing their mittens on purpose. Disguised by darkness, they zip open their packs and scramble about, losing all manner of black apparel. Gloves, scarves, hats, t-shirts, all get fiercely scrunched up and furiously packed down. Every back alley bin, all the dark crannies of old buildings morph into hidey holes. Here, stuff your hoodie under this dumpster. Your balaclava, that's bloody well what drain pipes are for. Black Cat concludes the obvious. Young humans are mad, aggrieved, and infuriated. She also notes their eagerness, pride. If they weren't so earnest, she'd call it bravado. These kittens stalk the dark so clumsily, she hears every footfall, each whisper. There's something so satisfying about a black act in the black of night. For sure. Batman black, Cauldron black. This black is totally beautiful. Too bad the museum isn't a cash point. I'd happily brew them up some Black Death. Not Black Death, Black Life. When the Bay Street men in black see our black being born, they're going to shit themselves in their pretty black suits. Black Cat recognizes that laughter. She tenses her shoulder, flattens her ears. We're midnight callies, calla lilies, a softer voice offers. Anarchy bursting into bloom. For our Black Cat, this is a kerfuffle of quite a different color. It is not the late night petting she has hoped for. She stiffens as naughty kittens reach for her awning, as 5 pairs of human claws maul her furry fabric and prod her metal bones. She gasps at the knife, at the tearing of her tender striped skin, at the jagged push of weapons thrust into her belly. She screams again and again until her awning sags, impregnated with baseball bats, crowbars, bricks, and the unmistakable edge of an axe. Kittens snigger and fist the air. They douse their flashlights and scatter like shrapnel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was hoping that you were going to start from the beginning because I love that Black Cat is the theater and is introduced as the host of the improv show that is the novel Kerfuffle. I want to talk to you about the structure of the novel. You can't see anybody, but throughout the book, there aren't any chapters, but there are these sections divided by meanwhile at the, and then another narrative point of view, and then another scene, and then meanwhile at the. How did you think about when you thought about writing? I'm sure inspired by your experiences as an improviser, but how did you think about it when you were sitting down to structure the novel? How did you know it was going to be an improv game?
I think I've always wanted to try to write a book in the structure or format of an improv game.
Mm-hmm.
And the improv game called Meanwhile comes from the old movies where they would hold up a slate and it would say, "Meanwhile, back at the ranch."
Yeah.
And so the way the improv games works is you'll build a scene for a little bit, and then one of the improvisers will yell, "Meanwhile, back at the museum." And then you'll see another scene at a museum, and then one of the improvisers will yell, "Meanwhile, back at the pizzeria," or wherever. And so instead of using chapters, just as you say, I decided to try to go with that format.
Mm-hmm.
It was a real lesson and learning curve to figure out how much of each scene to get on the page without telling too much or telling too little,
Mm-hmm.
and making it possible to hop back to that maybe 5 or 6 moves later.
Yeah.
But that was really fun to figure that out as well.
Yeah, it was fun to read. And just as you say, in hopping back into a scene, 5 or 6 scenes later, it was interesting as a reader to go, oh yeah, right, like, and to remind myself this is where we were. Yeah, that's great. So we're going to hear another reading.
Meanwhile, back at the museum, Nellie Wolf checks her watch. In the Roman Britain wing, it's 5 p.m. It's closing time. She lays a shielding hand over her 9-month baby bump and clenches her crutch. "Stop the damn dilly-dally," she whispers. "Just get the dirty deed done." Do all improvisers talk to themselves, often abusing alliteration? Absolutely. So yesterday, when the sword in the stone display case began to speak, Nellie did not question her sanity, only his motives. In Fortress Toronto, all speech is suspect. On the brink of the summit, Gladius Britannicus 5th century CE is either opportune or an opportunist, her savior or a sleeper sword. For all her 6 years working at the museum, it's been as mute as Harpo Marx, foisting no jab until it began chanting this refrain nonstop. "Behold the once and future sting. Take me up, cast me away." Nellie concludes the obvious. This sword wants to be stolen, wants it bad. In Arthur's day, it severed ears. Today, from the far side of plexiglass, it talks them off. She leans in, she listens. In pun and proclamation, its rousing cry is clever. In gift and dare, it's a tease, a gauntlet thrown down. As a rusty blade still rasping to qualify as sharp, it's valiantly loyal to the dream of Camelot. But if stealing from any museum is unwise, pinching an ancient Arthurian artifact that can scream bloody murder is docent suicide. This should, but does not, give our Nellie cause for pause. Her Friday smash and grab must be now or never. "You're quite the cut-up, Mr. Blade," she finally whispers back, carefully lowering her guitar case to the creaky hardwood. "But if you want me to break you out of here, you've got to cut the rapier wit." Thus engaged, the sword finds the true tang of its tongue. "List close, piquant lady fair. To win my freedom, I would spin you a tale. A new Camelot of mists and spires, of knights so bold and ladies bolder. It won't be the soft keen of a bard. It won't be the way you've heard our tales. But all those you've heard from so far have had a tongue tied to the telling. Mine is forged in fire. Mine purses flesh. I'll thrust my words in vernacular, yours, not mine, to ensure their hearing. Arthur was an asshole. Gwen was a whore. Lancelot a pedophile, and Merlin a Charlatan in a stolen hat. But Mordred, now there was magic. There was a boy with stabbing. Nellie winks. That's one slick pickup line, Mr. Blade. You had me at list. Then, milady, perhaps you are too easily had. Thank you.
That is fantastic. You're such a great reader.
Thank you.
That is honestly a joy to listen to. One of the best parts of reading books that are full with such rich detail and history and things that I experienced, like the G20 Summit, but have very little memory of because of what was going on in our life at the time. But I love having to look things up, and I did at the very beginning spend a bit of time looking up Excalibur and the myth and the story. How was it is all of this stuff just things that are in your head, or did you actually look for symbolism and look for like artistic literary details that you could put in for symbolism or a deeper meaning?
I think it's all in my head. I think I have to admit to that. I wrote the first draft of this novel, which was terrible, shortly after the G20 Summit. And then I realized I didn't know how to write it yet, and I kind of left it. And when I came back to it, just before the pandemic started and during the pandemic and all throughout the editing process, I just decided I was going to make myself happy. I was going to put all of my favorite things into this book. So, you know, The Sound of Music is there, and the X-Men are there, and of course Sherlock Holmes is there. He's one way or another in every book I've ever written.
Oh, awesome.
And I did fact check certain things just to make sure my memory was good, but all of those things, the book is a representation of what Andy talks about in his mind, that his mind is forever gathering up bits and pieces of the world and keeping them, because you never know what you might be able to use on stage. And that I wanted the book to represent what an improviser's mind looks like.
Yeah. And that The Sound of Mutants is an improv game, an improv choice that they take from the audience at some point in the book. And the list, I must say how impressed I was by the list of audience things that you threw out that are coming from your brain and not a group of an audience behind you. It was very impressive. And one of those things, as a former improviser, I was like, man, that would be a good scene. Oh, that would be a good scene. Every single one of them that you listed, it was great. So you started this first draft 12 years ago and finished it during the pandemic. How was that? I feel like some people just blossomed creatively during the pandemic and got so much beautiful stuff out into the world. How has writing in the pandemic been for you and finishing Kerfuffle?
It's been a real sort of mixed blessing in several ways. I'm very high risk. And so for the first 18 months, I literally did not leave my apartment, could not, under doctor's orders. And also decided to do it entirely as principled as possible and keep my pandemic footprint as small as possible. I thought it was in principle to send people to my door for frivolous things. One more body in the street is one more chance to mutate the virus.
Right.
And so I didn't accept gifts or order anything online or take takeout. And I'm a terrible cook. The only thing I allowed into my apartment were groceries or medical needs. And that was incredibly difficult and isolating.
Yeah.
But it also made it possible, for example, to physically go to an event. I need to sort of do nothing for 2 days ahead of time to make sure I'm not worn out. And then it wears me out so much with the driving and the parking and the getting there that I really am in too much pain to do much of anything for 2 days afterwards.
Right.
Whereas virtual events, I'm much more economic around my time and my pain. I'm able to manage both much easier, which made it possible to do a lot more writing.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I'm not happy that you were isolated for 18 months, but the fact that we got kerfuffle from it is a blessing in some way. How are you working on anything now? Has the creative energy been snowballing?
I'm writing a couple of articles that I've been asked to write. I'm going to write an article, for example, for Broadview on how my brother and I found each other thanks to DNA testing. We're both adopted, and I'm exactly 1 week older than he is.
Wow.
And we'll leave it there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's going to be Broadview.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading that. That's interesting. You're 1 week. That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we talked about the novel being set up like an improv game, but there's another aspect of the novel that I felt was also very related to improv, because improv is not necessarily always funny.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times and I think you've said this, that or Miss Palmer in the book says this. I can't think of where I heard it, but a lot of times improv, the personal lives of the actors on stage come in to the game or into the scene that they're writing, and it can sometimes become more tragic than comedic.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find yourself as an actor trying to find the funny of it. And I found that Kerfuffle did that. It's so funny. There's a lot of really fun and funny parts of the novel, but there are also some really complex and tragic and grievous grief filled aspects.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't sound right. To the novel. And how did you balance that as a writer, knowing that there was, this need for funny, but also the real?
Yeah, I think I had a lot of help from that, from the 3 decades of 15-year-olds that I taught improv to.
Mm-hmm.
And when you compete in the Canadian Improv Games, there aren't just humor events. There's something called a life event, where you're given a suggestion from the audience and you have to play out a scene in a way that is complicated and real and can
Mm-hmm.
get tragic or serious. Can also have moments of fun, but the goal of the life event is to be real.
Yeah.
So having watched 15-year-olds do that for years, I wanted to honor what they were able to do and the honesty that they reached for by trying to have moments in the improv that were very touching and sometimes sad and sometimes difficult. And I also thought that represents the best of what Brecht thought that the kind of theater that they're trying to put together represents, that it is something that makes people question their lives in general and wonder what their options are, what their choices are, and talk about it afterwards. I learned that from Archie Bunker, believe it or not. And
Right.
anybody who's old enough to remember anything about All in the Family, Archie was a bigot. Archie had, so many negative views about so many things, but they also touched on topics that were verboten to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the TV went off, my parents and I would actually talk about those things.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And that was the first time I realized that humor could be a gateway into some very serious topics. So it's all those things. It's wanting to have things that are just truly enjoyable and funny. It's wanting to have things that make it possible to be really touching and serious as well as funny.
Yeah.
And it's also saying the two aren't polar opposites. There are ways in which they blend and bond together and lead to each other and inform each other.
Yeah.
And that's what I tried to get across all together in the book.
Yeah. I felt like Connie did that brilliantly, like her character, her arc, and her I think I can say this because I think it comes up pretty early in the book, but her childhood sexual abuse, and the person who was her abuser ends up being in her life, and she does something that is, getting her own justice. But it's so funny, even the disgusting men that she bumps into, there's humor to that, and you did that so well. Were any of these characters, because you say you worked with 15-year-olds for 30 years, were any of these characters' lives born from inspiration, real inspiration?
Well, this is where I tell you that the disgusting man that Connie meets is my ex. We'll just leave that one there. Um, the kids are sort of in the 5 members of Kerfuffle, who are all just about turning 30, are in some ways amalgams of certain students. I did teach a pair of twins from Haiti. They weren't named Calvaire and Cesar, but I did, I did teach these 2 young men twins from Haiti, and the idea of twins on stage is very, very rich in improv. And so I wanted to talk about that. Connie is based on loosely my best friend in high school.
Yeah.
But they aren't sort of
replicas.
No, they aren't replicas of, I can't point and say this is this person or this is that person.
Yeah. Andy's story arc too is also, I don't want to say that Connie's got all the tragedy and the drama. Andy's storyline is also really good. I thoroughly enjoy stories that have a bunch of characters, and I think anyone who's listening to this will enjoy it if they love character-driven novels. So Miss Palmer is a drama teacher in Kerfuffle, and there are a lot of times in the novel where Miss Palmer is not just a teacher, but a life educator for the kids. How much of Miss Palmer was drawn out of your own personal experience?
In the first draft of the book, she was Miss Sullivan.
Okay.
And I liked it that way. But then I thought more and more about how improv is attempting to break down that curtain, right, between what's on stage and what's in real life.
Yeah.
And one of the ways improv does that is by having an audience participant. The audience participant provides the suggestion from which the scenes are built. The audience participants are playing along in their heads, right? So their improv in their head isn't the same as the person beside them, but that's fine, right? Yeah. So I wanted to extend that idea of audience participant even a little further and to break down that curtain a little further. And I thought, okay, let's actually use me.
Yeah.
And she's a character. She's not exactly like me, but I would say about 90% of the things Ms. Palmer says to her class are things that I actually said to mine.
Yeah. That's great. She's a great character. And clearly one of those, I mean, she's so much a part of all of their lives that the impact is felt in almost everything that happens to them and what they experience. Just to let everybody know, I always forget to do this. I don't know how many times I'm going to do these online things, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You can direct it to Kaylee personally, and she'll ask the questions on your behalf. And speaking of Miss Palmer, there's a scene where Nellie, who is the disabled main, I would call her the main character. She's disabled and pregnant, and she walks with a cane. And in high school, she had a cane. And during improv, the boys in the class thought it was hilarious to grab her cane and use it as a gun or use it as a whatever sword or whatever prop their genius minds created. And there's a great scene between Miss Palmer and Nellie where she talks to her. It was so great because it was a very respectful conversation, and Miss Palmer wasn't going to intervene unless Nellie wanted her to. That was a really great conversation. And I want to talk about disability in this novel because it's not the only time a lot of the characters are checked for their language throughout the novel. And I wanted to talk to you about disability in this novel because I know how important it is to you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. Some 23% of Canadians, according to the last census, are disabled. So imagine what that would really look like in literature. It would mean that 1 out of every 4 characters in every book is disabled. It would mean that 1 out of every 4 authors at every Lit Fest, at every, prize ceremony would be disabled. It would mean that 1 out of every 4 editors and publicists and agents and publishers would all be disabled.
Mhm.
Instead, we're virtually erased. You can read whole books and there isn't a disabled person in it anywhere. Too common.
Mhm.
So I wanted to be sure in this book that there were multiple disabilities, that it was reflected in our numbers. So every time I had a fourth character, I made certain that one of them was disabled, because
Mhm.
I just simply wasn't going to underrepresent us.
Yeah.
So we have Nellie on her crutch, which was my crutch. Before I moved to a walker, I was on a crutch for several years. We have Sherm, who has a really bad stutter. And then there are sort of, I think we can say Andy's mother has dementia.
Mhm.
And then there are other characters who have slightly less clear disabilities, although it does come kind of across in certain ways, certain degrees of neurodivergence in the other characters as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it was really important to me that not only that disability be represented, but that I did both. I talked about the way ableism is a terrible barrier. So Nellie faces barriers trying to get simply to improv on time because she has trouble taking the subway. And people say terrible, horrible things to her on the
Mhm.
subway all the time. As a disabled pregnant person, there, the hatred that she faces is extraordinary.
Mhm.
And I also wanted to say, but that does not mean our lives are miserable, and that there's joy and humor and solidarity that comes out of being open about your disability, and asking other people to see it and
Mhm.
respect it and work with it with you.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, it's always a challenge in thinking as an abled person. And I'd love your perspective on this, because I definitely want to make sure that there's representation in anything that I write. But I always feel that discomfort in appropriating a story or having a character as a prop, really, as
Mhm.
a plot device, and or just a way for me to feel or look like I'm being inclusive. So how do you feel about that, about having disabled characters in fiction, in not just literary fiction, but in film and television, and how would you like to see them represented if the author of or creator of the story isn't disabled?
Yeah, I think I can answer that from the point of view of the disabled community, and then from my personal point of view.
Mhm.
From the point of view of the disabled community in general, we want to see disabled characters. We want able people to write disabled characters. Please do.
Yeah.
What we don't want is able people doing any more of making the disabled character the protagonist and writing in their first person voice,
Mhm.
because that is appropriation.
Mhm.
Just the way it would be appropriation for an author to write about a marginalized character who came from a group they did not belong.
Mhm. Yeah.
So please don't do that. But any kind of secondary or cameo character in a novel, why not? Why isn't the landlord disabled?
Yeah.
Why isn't the boss disabled? Who knows?
Yeah.
And there can be all kinds of representations that don't have to guide the whole storyline, but are there in the world, just the way disability is there in the world.
Mhm. Yeah. And you and I, how important the facial difference community is to me in that.
Mhm.
And so I'll just add, if you have a character who's different, don't make them the villain. I feel like
Yes,
that's a
yes.
trope that's
And don't make them
overused.
inspiring. Inspiration porn
Right.
is a real problem.
Yeah.
Inspiration porn is where the disabled person doesn't really have their own voice. All they do is inspire able people. And
Yeah.
when these inspired able people, what they get from this is that they don't actually have to do anything to end ableism,
Yeah.
because the individual disabled person has already solved it for themselves. Isn't that
Yeah.
lovely?
Yeah.
So yeah, inspiration porn is a trope. Similar to the disabled person dying is a trope.
Yeah.
And everybody feels horrible and sad that they died and wish they'd treated them better. So yeah, some of those tropes, if you're going to include disabled characters in your books, and I hope you all do, take some time to educate yourself about what kind of tropes probably you want to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. And the G20 Summit is a huge character in this novel. It exists. It's in the background, kind of. All we don't get to know exactly what everyone's planning in detail leading up to it. And I wanted to talk to you about that because, as I said, I don't remember a lot because of what was happening in our lives. How much of what was in that first draft, which I'm assuming is full of details that you experienced at the moment, were there, and how much was inspired with stuff that's happened years after
Mm.
the kettling?
Yeah, that's a
The
really interesting
protest?
question. I was horrified at the way something seemed to shift in the media representation and in the public position around protest with the
Mhm.
G20.
Yeah.
And I think it was deliberate. I think the police instigated it. I think there was a delegitimization of the right to protest.
Yeah.
There was this leap in the minds of the public that protesters were all from somewhere else, all rabble rousers, all vandals, all
Yeah.
criminals.
Yeah.
And if they could criminalize and ruin the reputations of protesters, fewer people would want to be one, wouldn't they?
Right.
And when I saw that happening, in the newscasts and in just what people were saying immediately after the G20 protest, when as a unionist, I had been on any number of protests to support education,
Hmm.
was part of organizing the biggest protest in Ontario, which was the fight against Mike Harris. So I don't want to see anything to do with protest being devalued in any way. I think it's an incredibly important part of democracy. So
Hmm.
that was my first impetus in writing that book. And it was also because those people were my kids. They were the same years of my students.
Hmm.
And I wasn't going to let people call them criminals and pretend I wasn't infuriated by that, because they
Yeah.
weren't.
Yeah.
So yes, it was really important to me to legitimize and validate and uphold and uplift the right to protest. And when I was doing the revisions, was right around the time when the police were doing the clearances of the encampments in parks.
Oh, yeah.
And so even though in August of 2020, when they were fined $16.5 million for the 1,100 protesters that they illegally arrested,
Yeah.
and those 1,100 protesters got anywhere from $5,000 to $24,000. And Mark Fenton was fired basically, and the part of the restitution were the cops supposed to retrain and do things differently.
Yeah.
Well, they aren't doing things differently, and those encampments proved it.
Right.
And I'll be a Cassandra here and say that I think we're going to see much worse protests, and we're going to see the cops behave even more badly again. Then
Yeah.
another 4 years of Doug Ford do not augur well.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And I had no idea about the kettling. When I first read it in Kerfuffle, I was like, what is, because you write it a couple of times. Not really in context, in the context of describing the protest, and some of the characters use it as a verb, and kettled, and I was like, what is this kettling thing? And then in looking it up and really understanding what the police do when they kettle protesters, I thought was disgusting. And I can't believe that continues to happen, but it does. And as you say, unfortunately, it probably will continue to happen.
Yes.
It's awful.
The kettle happened right at Queen and Spadina, right in that spot where in my intro, a black cat is sitting on her roof looking out.
Mhm.
It's also the site of the old Standard Theater, where really important in leftist theater history, where the only one night play of Eight Men Speak was up. It
Yeah.
was a communist play from its writing through to its presentation. Dorothy Livesay and a bunch of other lefties of the time were involved. And it's really sad that people were kettled right in front of that really iconic building,
Yeah,
which is now a bank, which I guess says everything about today.
where we are.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
and I think too that that kettle, I'm glad it was proved illegal. I'm glad that the police got at least a slap on the wrist and people got lots of money. But I'm concerned that the idea of trapping people, holding
Yeah.
them there for 4 hours, not letting them go to the bathroom, to provoke somebody doing something for which they could be arrested, which
Arrested.
is the goal.
Yeah.
I think that is going to happen again. And, you
Yeah.
know, yeah, we're not done with kettling.
Ugh, God. That was the other, I forgot to mention that when we were talking about pausing and looking stuff up. The Eight Men Speak
Hmm.
play only being performed once, and then as a result being stopped in other cities in North America was
Mhm.
incredible to me, that fighting for free speech, but then also saying, well, not communism, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kaylee, does anyone have any questions?
There's always like a multiple step process to bring me up. I'm like, yes, yes, I promise. Yes, we have a question. And the first question is, what drew you to improv, not just in the book, but in life?
I'm lazy. I have the attention span of a gnat. And so to be able to make stuff up on the spot and then move it to somewhere else and do something else was just so exciting to me.
Yeah.
And to be able to share the writing of the story. So, there are as many as 5 people on stage with you, or at least 2, and you're both writing the story and both reacting and building together. All of those things were really, really exciting to me. I really, right from the first time I saw improv, I went, I want to do that. I want to know what that is.
Yeah.
I want to find out all the possibilities that can be. So I was just really attracted to it personally.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of fun. I did Second City, and I did a few years of theater sport, a few seasons of theater sports, which was so much fun.
Mhm.
And it really does expand your writing, or the potential to see.
Mhm.
And now why people like Kids in the Hall and the writers on Saturday Night Live can come up with such funny sketches, because they probably just sit in a room and improvise it.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly.
Do
Yeah.
you still do you still participate in the improv community or workshops or anything like that?
No, through my students a little bit. I'm still in touch with a lot of my former improvisers, but my arthritis is at the point right now where I couldn't do any of the movement.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I have very fond memories of it, but I'm not really doing it now.
Yeah. Oh, and I want to go see an improv show now. That's after after reading Kerfuffle. Kaylee, any more questions?
Yeah, we have one more question so far. And it's so they say, this is kind of not directly about the book, but you seem very involved in activist spaces. Thank you. How do you find that balance in this world where there is so much that needs our attention and needs our voices?
Hmm. I guess it's about finding a certain balance. Um, I've been involved now for, quite a number of years in CanLit, trying to make it more wheelchair accessible. And I'm very frustrated. I'm extremely frustrated that everybody went through the 2 years of inaccessibility during the pandemic. And then far too many people have just decided that Doug Ford declared it was over, like he was a magician. And people are now rushing back to the same old inaccessible buildings, rushing back to dropping their virtual components, which are more accessible. And some people are doing, some organizers in some CanLit events are doing something which I find even more annoying in some ways. They're saying, well, yes, our building is inaccessible, but we're going to film it and put it online, as if that solves the problem. And it absolutely does not solve the problem. Virtual accessibility never replaces physical accessibility, if only because I would like to work there.
Yeah.
right? Disabled writers need to be able to present there.
Mhm.
Disabled attendees need to be able to go there in person to have the
Yeah.
same networking that they get only in person.
Yeah.
So that seems to me really obvious, and somebody my grade nines would have understood, but I find it extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
So I have to pace myself, and I have to sort of admit that just because something is obvious to me, it isn't obvious to everyone else. And pick your battles is probably the very best advice to any activist fighting any cause whatsoever. Pick your battles, pick the ones that either you're not going to win, but it's important to fight them,
Mhm.
or you think you could win and you get lots of help and try to win it.
Mhm.
But pick them. You can't fight everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one thing I don't understand about, and I have added John Tory about this a number of times, that I really don't understand how landlords are allowed to lease public space or space
Mm.
that's going to be used by, a company or business that's going to be open to the general public, and they are allowed to be inaccessible, because
Mhm.
it's like, to me, it's like segregation, right? You might as well just put a sign on the window that says no disabled people allowed. And I don't know how municipalities continue to just grandfather in over and over and over again this ridiculous idea that we're doing our best, and this is
Mhm.
is what it is.
Yeah.
So I feel for you, and that's the part of the reason why Junction Reads is continuing to do online, even into our next season and years after,
Mhm.
an online aspect of it anyway.
Yeah, I haven't actually sort of an answer for that.
Yes.
One that I use for myself.
Yeah.
My original training is as an historian, and I look back at the ugly laws, which started sort of with the formation of cities, but went right through the Victorian years, right up into the Second World War.
Yeah.
And the ugly laws are an umbrella term for laws that kept disabled people, poor people, and vagrant people off the street. It was illegal if you were unsightly, if you were an
Wow.
ugly beggar, read a deformed beggar,
Yeah.
in the vernacular of the day, to be on the street. The police were entitled to pick you up and move you elsewhere.
Jeez.
And so you don't have to build a building for those people if it's illegal for them to be on the street in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those buildings that we saw, the last 200 years of building in Toronto have been for able people with no qualms about it. They don't care.
Yeah.
And Doug Ford knows absolutely that none of his buildings, either governmental or just in general, the businesses in general, very few of them are accessible. But it would cost too much money in Doug Ford's mind, that money is more important than accessibility in
Yeah.
his mind. So they come up with all kinds of ways to maintain the ugly laws rather than decide that accessibility is the priority.
Right.
And I also think, excuse me, the pandemic gave me another layer to an answer that I didn't want to look at for a long time, but I really do believe this, that ableism is so tied to colonial capitalism and so tied to hierarchies and completely and totally tied to eugenics.
Yeah.
That one of the reasons so many people are prepared to go back to leading their normal life back to normal is because they don't care if old people die. They don't care if disabled people die. It's seen as survival of the fittest, and it's eugenics, but they don't see it that way. It's the Nazis saying disabled people are life unworthy of life and should be exterminated, but they don't see it that way.
Right.
Because colonial capitalism tells us your worth comes from being able to work,
Yeah.
being able to produce and consume. And if you can't do those two things, colonial capitalism has no need for you. And far too many people have bought into that and decided that, yeah, they'll go ahead and, have gatherings and go to big events and go indoors unmasked because they just don't care if somebody else dies because they don't know who they are. It really is a vicious network of the way that ableism is tied to capitalism, is tied to eugenics in a way that I didn't fully understand until the pandemic.
Yeah. And the fact that the pandemic followed this, and we're not living in the States, but we might as well be living in the States. The fact that the individualism that was booming as a result of he who shall not be named, supporting that and applauding that.
Yes.
Having the pandemic immediately follow him, I feel like everyone's just put their selfish me hat on, and they don't care anymore. They're they're emboldened.
Yes.
In
The disability community has done a good job, if anyone was listening, about explaining, the way I phrase it is that individual risk assessment about COVID is a neoliberal scam. That you don't just do an individual risk assessment and say, okay, well, I'm young, I've been vaccinated, I'll go do whatever the hell I want. You say, my community needs me to stay home. Because collective risk assessment is more important than individual risk assessment. Individual risk assessment just gets you out there like a good little lemming of capitalism, buying and making and laboring without compunction. And the collective risk assessment is going to be the only thing that saves our lives. And people are unwilling to do that right now.
Yeah, that, which is very unfortunate. But there we go. We did exactly what Kerfuffle did. We had fun and funny and ended with the seriousness of the pandemic and the importance of disability activism. I really hope that anybody who's watching, if you're here now or watching this video later, that you hear what Dorothy Ellen Palmer is saying about accessibility and disability and our collective responsibilities. Dorothy, thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate you sharing your words and sharing the reading. We are going to, is there a question? David, do you have a question?
He's clapping.
Oh, okay, sorry. I don't know what the difference between the yellow hands that pop up on the thing. I'm so excited. Renaissance Press has donated a copy of Kerfuffle to raffle off. 2 copies, actually. We're going to raffle one off here, and then we're going to do a big social media thing to get people to like and follow and watch the video. So Kaylee, let's raffle off a copy of Kerfuffle.
Right.
Woohoo!
Yeah, do it old school. I write everyone's name down. So fun.
That's cool.
All right. Our winner for today is Marianne Miller.
Yay! Marianne, that's awesome. This is Marianne's first time back in a while. So that's so exciting.
Excellent.
That's so exciting. Thank you again, Dorothy, for joining us and talking to us about Kerfuffle. I can't believe this is our second last event. We're back here on June 19th with Kevin Wilson, K.R. Wilson, who is up in our gallery right now. And that will be our last event of the season. And if you're not able to join us then, please follow the blog at junctionreads.ca, and we're all over social media. We'll be back next year with a hybrid, hopefully, fingers crossed, if the Ontario Arts Council supports us, and we will have a hybrid kind of in-person and virtual, continuing with the Zoom online. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you,
everybody. Thank you, Kaylee.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everybody. It was fun.
Yeah, great. Dorothy,
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye, everyone.